I am Elston Floor, a member of the board of the Historical Association, director of its Oral History Project. I am also a member of the Department of English, Theater, and Speech at Guthrie College. I'm happy to be meeting today with Mr. Linn Peterson, who resides with his wife Mary at 540 East Hill Street in McPherson, Kansas. Linn has done a lot of excellent work in historical matters in McPherson County, and we are very grateful for his willingness to share some of the information that he has gathered, not only about his own family, but also about other settlers in the Smoky Valley. We have a picture here of Linn with his grandfather, Papa Linn, who was one of the early settlers in the county. I understand this was taken for the centennial of the McPherson County Centennial.
1970.
In 1970. So first I would like to have you, Linn, tell us something about this very colorful ancestor of yours known as Papa Linn.
Well, Papa Linn, his actual name was Anders Gustav Linn, and I've seen it spelled different ways. L-I-N-N is the correct spelling on it. I've seen it spelled L-E-N and L-I-N in different ways.
So you're named after him?
Right, my first name, or my second name. I'm really Arnold Linn, and I go by Linn. So that's where my name came from, my mother's side, her father. And of course, he was born in Sweden, near Borås, Bramhult Parish, I believe in 1843, in Västergötland. And he died before I was born, in 1901, in Higgins, Texas. He had moved down into that area. He was only 57 years old when he died. He was one of the early day settlers of McPherson County, and we have a list of the early settlers coming into the county in 1866.
Now, this first list is of the county in general.
Correct. 1866, it lists in the 84 McPherson County Atlas the names of A.G. Linn and H.J. Nordland, Swedes. Linn coming to Union Township and Nordland to Smoky Hill Township. George Carbaugh, Ohio. Thomas Mathis came from Indiana. S.D. Shields from Indiana, and they all settled in Smoky Hill Township also. Francis McNeely mentions him as an Irishman, and Bertha Brainerd coming from Wisconsin, settling also in Union Township, and Hannah Mins in Harper Township, and the two Reese brothers, Sanford and Lowell Reese, settling in Gypsum Creek Township, and they were from New York and Wisconsin, respectively. The various stories tell about the early day Swedes, and there's a list of other names that we might mention too, of the first 8 Swedes, and then I think
these have been mentioned by Dr. Lindquist.
Dr. Lindquist mentions in Smoky Valley people, and that group includes Gustav Johnson, all coming in 1866, P. Spongberg, L. Hupquist, A.G. Linn, all from Västergötland, H.J. Norland and Ahlquist from Skåne, Erik Oxa from Västmanland, and Carl Johnson from Småland. And in the Andreas History of Kansas, they list 10 names, so there's a little discrepancy in the name, but it is very prevalent that my grandfather was in the first group that settled there in the Smoky Valley in 1866.
Now, before you proceed, you have a very fine picture here of Papa Linn.
I'm sorry, this picture is a copy, but I have a shiny finish photo that I'm not able to lay my hands. It's interesting that it shows him as he's probably repairing fence. He has a fence stretcher, he's barefooted, he has a rope around his waist, an old hat on, and this barn, I think, is the barn on the Don Lundquist farm, which he built a silo in back when he built this barn.
Now, where would that be in relationship to Lindsborg?
That is south, or be west and a little south of, it'd be in the Fremont community. It'd be between Lindsborg and Fremont, down along the river. But that's probably a typical picture of what he looked like as an early day settler.
Thank you. Now you have something more in detail about his arrival in McPherson, or in the Smoky Valley area.
Yes, he came from Sweden in 1865 and came to New York and then on to Chicago. Apparently with other Swedes, there were an organization for the laborers, probably for the stonemasons, arranged for free passage to Lawrence, Kansas, and they rode the train to St. Louis and then on to Kansas City, and then walked on the newly laid railroad tracks to Lawrence, Kansas. When they arrived, the railroad camp they asked for food there, that there were no food to be had, and 3 out of the 9 men were given work, and they found shelter in an old schoolhouse. There's a dirty, filthy place, and they were not able to stay there very long. A Swedish peddler in the city then helped them to buy some bricklayers' equipment, and so they could maybe find work. And the temperature became so high that they were not able to work. Mr. Norland suggested they go on to Junction City, where they'd heard that it was possible to earn a livelihood by chopping wood, and they thought they could earn some money that way. And that group then consisted of this Gustav Johnson, A.G. Linn, Spongberg, and Nordland, and Hultquist. They walked 109 miles to Junction City, according to the account that's, I think, the one in Dr. Virgine's story, and then it's been translated, the Bilt translation. They found these trees were so big that they didn't even attempt to cut them down, but they were given food and permitted to sleep in a hen house by a Swede who had arrived there in that Junction City ahead of them. And then Papa Linn and Gustav Johnson worked in a stone quarry and got $4.50 a day for their work. And they did some work in the way of hay making, earned some good money.
Well, this was where now they did?
This would been in Junction City, right. And I think what they did is more or less move along the railroad as it went on out. They moved along the railroad further west. They stayed there for 1 year until March of 1866. Then they heard about land being available out further west, and as the railroad went on with its right-of-way through the state of Kansas, the Swedes then decided they wanted to secure land west of Junction City. In the last days of April 1866, they hired a pair of horses for $35, and they had plans to settle in the Solomon River Valley. When they came into the valley, they found some dead cattle, and they talked to a cowboy, and they were told that the water was poisonous and that living creatures would die if they drank the water. This discouraged them and frightened them, so they continued on then west to Salina and to the Smoky Hill River Valley. And then from there, they went on into what became McPherson County later on. They stopped on the way at with the Swede by the name of Carlgren, who had mentioned, I think, in some of the stories, had lived in a tree, and he was in probably close to McPherson County, but he had come ahead of them, lived in a hollow tree, and they had learned to write English well enough to be able to speak fluently also. They forded the river where the Shields home stood later, and then they came on further to where this Irishman, Francis McNeely, had his dugout. He had arrived, I think, a month or so before, and there was also one of the Spongbergs, apparently, that was there probably a month or two ahead.
May I interrupt here?
Yes.
Do you know anything more about this Francis McNeely?
I've read of a genealogical story of him in one of the books. That there was no evidence of him being married, no evidence of a family, so that's
so he was just a
end.
Temporary inhabitant.
I think he lived there for some time, but and probably, I'm not sure even where he's buried, but there's quite a detailed story of him in one of these books.
Would he been probably connected with the Civil War in some way, maybe?
I'm not sure without looking up that
I see.
story.
Okay.
But he was the head of the Swedes, apparently maybe a
Would
month
that
or
be
so.
an Irishman, McNeil?
Well, they call him a Scotsman, but I think it's
Scotsman.
Irish, really. I think they referred in some of the accounts to him being a Scotsman, but McNeely is
I see.
more sounding of Irish. So we find this group coming on into the Smoky Valley. They found this high blue stem grass, some 6 feet high, and the Swedes each claimed a quarter of land and returned to Junction City where the land office was. And then they talked to 3 other Swedes to also file claims. So this was in May of 1866. There must have been others involved, so it mentions as many as 17 Swedes were to lay claims to 160 acres of land in the Smoky River Valley.
160 acres each.
Yes, each
Was
quarter
this
section.
homesteading? Was
This would be homesteading, yes. These horses that they had rented, when they brought them back, they were fatter than when they took them out, and so they didn't charge them as much as they had planned. They only charged them $30, so they thought the horses had been all taken care of when they got back to Junction City. And they remained then in Junction City for several months to earn some more money, and then went on west to build their homes or have their dugouts. There's mention in some of the stories that Grandpa Linn lived in a hole in the riverbank. So I think that probably somewhat of a dugout or a cave that to begin with. Then there are other stories of this group back in '67. Some others came and they mentioned having mules and horses and so on. So some of them were able to have a little more manpower or horsepower other than just doing all the work themselves.
You never mentioned oxen?
There's mention of oxen. Here, Alquist drove 5 oxen out from Junction City. He was the only one that had his wife with him, and the story brings out that his wife was an artist from Stockholm, and she didn't like it, so apparently they both went back to Sweden. None of the others ever thought of returning to Sweden. They were apparently happy to have their own land and have the freedoms that they sought. Some of them brought cows from Junction City, and it mentions several of them doing bricklaying work, earning $90 a month, and at that time as a laborer, they could probably get $30 a month. The foreman would get more, of course.
Did any of them work on the railroad?
I'm sure that a number of them had done work on the railroad to help earn money to build their homes and to acquire cattle and horses and so on. And my grandfather did work on the railroad. I have an interesting story. This was published in the paper some time back in the 70s, where Papa Linn got the name Papa because he was able to talk English and apparently to help the other Swedes who in many cases probably couldn't talk any English. And they had worked on the Union Pacific Railroad as it was built out toward Hayes and Ellsworth, and they probably would not have any time off, but it got to be Christmas time and they wanted to get off, so they got on the train, and they didn't have any money. They couldn't get free rides because they actually weren't on vacation, and they were not authorized to have free rides. So Papa Linn arranged for them to get on the train, and when the conductor came to ask for the tickets, they began talking in their Swedish language and counting the money they had, and they didn't have money to pay for tickets. So they kept on arguing, and he kept arguing with the conductor until they got to the Salina area, and then Grandpa Linn told them to get off and run like hell, and they were glad to do it since that was where they wanted to go anyway. This story was published in 1944 in the Daily Republican, so it was apparently a recollection of my father in being interviewed in a story about the courthouse, in which, of course, Papa Linn was he was the stone foreman on the courthouse, so he told this story when they were having an anniversary back here.
Were you finished with the first part of what we were...
There's some other mention here, and I don't know whether we want to make... I might just glean through this, that there was mention of people coming and staying with Papa Linn when they had not gotten their own claim, or borrowing his animals. I think he was quite often loaned money to the people when they first came, and was known to be generous this way. Probably too generous, because I think later on he lost a lot of his property because of not.
But he lived first in a dugout.
Yes, he lived down along the river. Then apparently later on he enjoyed having cattle and raising cattle, so he went up into the bluffs to the west and the little bit south, be right pretty much straight north of Fremont, up in the bluffs, and he had several sections of pasture land up there, and we've been up in that area a number of times. You have to go through a number of gates and so on.
This is called the Spanish Utes, or
correct. And he had several dugouts up there. He planted a timber claim, and there are still the remains of that timber claim. By planting so much timber, and in the case of his plantings, there were walnut trees and black walnut trees and catalpa and Osage orange. And apparently back in the 30s, when they had the drought, a lot of these trees died, and they'd been cut off probably a foot above the ground. And a lot of them had been knocked over, so those trunks lay there, and then the trees, in many cases, the hedge doesn't deteriorate, and that still lays there in that area. It's something like 10 to 20 acres of timber, and it's on Fred Sundberg's pasture land up there. He had showed me the deed that the government issued in the case of acquiring a timber claim, as you would a homestead. They gave it to promote planting timber and this type of thing, and that was his timber claim. And then he had his dugout down along the creek, and now there have been dams put in, so it's quite different from what it was then. I can remember as a boy that we had several people go out and show us where that area was, and they had difficulty finding it. We did locate it later on. We've taken pictures and found a few of the stones that you could see he had hewn out to use maybe in either a little house or later on, and probably in a dugout before that. But he liked to have cattle, so I think he lived part of his time up there. Also, I'd mentioned in some of my recollections that reading that they had burned out several times. So back in those days, it was quite common. They had fires and lost everything they had.
Now, when he first came, of course, he was single, and then he was eventually married. And we need to hear about that, and also about something you have on his citizenship.
Yes,
we have a picture here.
This is a picture of his first wife. Her name was Viola Jane Maxwell originally, and she was Scotch-Irish background. They'd come from the Indiana area. We did not know this. My mother and her sister wouldn't believe it when we went to Salina and found that she had actually been married before to a Civil War veteran by the name of Hockman, and he had passed away, and that she, by virtue of having been a widow of a Civil War veteran, was entitled to 160 acres of land, and she lived on this land prior to the time apparently that she was married to Grandpa Linn.
Now this again is Viola.
This is Viola Jane Maxwell Hockman, and then she became Linn when she married him.
So her maiden name was Maxwell.
Maxwell.
And then she was married to Hockman.
Hockman, yes. And we know nothing about that family except tracing it through the War Department on Civil War veterans. We found that he was in a light artillery, enrolled in Lockport, Illinois, served something like 3 years, was discharged in Nashville, Tennessee by virtue of expiration of his service, and he had been born in Prussia, 5'11" tall, blue eyes and dark hair. That's about all we know about him. His name was Joseph, and but she was able to have this quarter section of land because she was a widow of a.
She got that by virtue of the fact that her husband had been in the U.S. military.
He was in the Union Army.
Union Army. Now that she had a homestead then.
Yes.
In the Smoky Valley.
Correct.
Where would that have been?
Well, This was, it would be, it's about 7 miles north of McPherson, about 3 miles east would be where you, so we've been out there. It was poor land. It was more suitable, I think, for pasture than for farming. I think it is being farmed now, but it was hilly land. It was not good land. And actually, I think one of her reasons for being out in this area, she was related to William J. Henry, who was one of the early postmasters in Lindsborg. And
related to William Henry.
Right. That was one reason she was in the area. And there, Henry's, he was prominent in the early days of Lindsborg, and he's buried in the Lindsborg Cemetery, and there are others, Henry's there also.
Would he maybe have been a brother-in-law or something?
I think that's correct. Now, she died in 1885 when my mother was born. They had previously had a daughter, Grace, who was something like 2 years old when my mother was born, and she passed away, Viola Jane, and then Grandpa Linn married a widow, Carolina Frederica Peel, in 1887. That was probably a year or so after, a couple of years after his first wife had died. And of course, she had her family, he had his 2 children, and they were married, and then they had their own family. So there's quite a sizable family of Linns and Peels.
What then happened to those girls?
The 2 young daughters were, he didn't feel that he could take care of them, so he let his former wife's relatives, the Maxwells, take care of the older girl, Grace, and they lived in the Americus, Kansas area near Lyons, in the Emporia area, and he then took her back after he remarried, so she was brought up then with the Peels and then with some more Linns that were born after he remarried. My mother, Emmy Jane Linn, was just a little baby, and she was taken by Grandpa Linn's sister, who was Mrs. Gustava Lundquist, Mrs. Carl J. Lundquist. He was an early day tailor in Lindsborg, and they took her into the family. They already had 4 boys and 4 girls, but they took her into the family, and she was raised as a member of that family until she grew up and was married.
Now, is this the point where we can take a look at that picture that identifies some of the Lundquist? This is the C.J.
This is Carl J. Lundquist. Carl's family grew up in Lindsborg. Most of them, and many of them left. In one case, as Alfred was the older son, and Mrs. Ada Weddle is a daughter.
This is Alfred.
Alfred. He was a clerk of the school board for many years and was sold insurance and so on. He went blind in his later years, and I think his widow took over his job temporarily as clerk of the school board. This is Carl, who was at one time a grocer in Lindsborg, and then later on went to California and was in the grocery business, and I think he ended up in the Arizona and California area. And this is Richard Lundquist, who lived in Lindsborg. He never married.
He worked with his...
He also was a tailor and helped his
grandfather.
Right.
Or father.
He was a Spanish-American War veteran. And this is Tina, who was never married. She was an old maid. And this is Carl J. and this is Gustava. This is Oscar, who went to the Kansas City area and became a grocer. This is Jenny, who went to the New Britain, Connecticut area. Most of these girls studied at Bethany College in art or music. In the case of Jenny, she went to the New Britain, Connecticut area, and she married a David Oman, who was a relative of the Oman and Arden that we used to hear way back in the days of radio. They were a piano duo that played. And the brother of David Oman was a pastor in the Connecticut area. And then there's Lily, was an artist. She was the next oldest. And this is Hattie, who married Martin Racine, and they moved to the Rock Island, or to the Rockford Illinois area.
Was that of the Rosine building family?
They are not related, I don't believe. My mother was a good friend of the Rosines, and the builder lived right across the street. They were good friends. But that is the family there. So when my mother was adopted, there were 9 children.
But is your mother there?
She's the little girl here. And,
Emma.
Emmy Jane.
Emmy Jane.
She got the Jane from Viola Jane, her mother.
Oh, yes.
Then another interesting picture, and this we didn't go into detail, but this is the entire Lundquist family in the front yard, and they're all standing so you can identify them. And we'll take this is the home that stood on the corner of Washington, and I'm not sure the street that goes right by on the north side of the Bethany home, and that has been replaced. Dr. Howarda built a fine home.
Green
there.
Street, or
I'm not sure the name of the street, but Dr. Howarda built the home, and it was owned by Kaiser's. I'm not sure who owns it now, but that's the corner where
are all 9 children on this?
I think the entire group's there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? The entire family. That's sort of an unusual picture to have the whole group.
That's probably a priceless picture.
That is a copy of the one that is really falling apart.
And you've talked somewhat about A.G. Linn's marriage to Mrs. Carolina Peel, didn't you?
Yes.
You finished with...
There was a family that lived in McPherson, and I think her husband had fallen on some of the wooden sidewalks in McPherson. I ran into this story, and was injured in some way that he passed away. He was a blacksmith. He had his own family of 4 boys and 1 girl. They were a little older, I think, than my mother and her sister. They were married and lived in a small house on South Chestnut in McPherson for a while, and then I think they moved out in the Fremont area, down along the Smoky there, or perhaps some of the time they were up in the Bluffs. I'm not sure of the time situation there. But after they were married, they had 3 more boys and 2 girls, so the family got larger and larger. I'd covered the story of the timber claim that after he'd gotten into the cattle raising, why he had his timber claim, and
This is your Papa Linn.
yes, right.
Do you have anything more on his farm work?
Of course, he was a stonemason. There's some mention that some of the Swedes in the Fremont area think that he could have helped in laying the stone for this old Fremont Lutheran church that still stands. However, he was not a Lutheran, and of course, in those days, the Lutheran pastors were not receptive to the Masons, and I don't know whether they could belong to the church. So and when he was buried, there's a Masonic emblem on his gravestone, so he apparently remained as a Mason, but he had belonged apparently this from the very beginning of coming to America, when he joined with men that did similar work to his, and where they helped him when he was getting started. He became rather wealthy back in the early days. I've looked through the atlas of 1884. It looked like he owned something like 800 or 900 acres of land scattered around in different areas in the north part of the county. And then, of course, he and his wife had owned some property in McPherson. But in the depressions back in the 80s and 90s, apparently he lost some of this land. It showed sheriff sales involved, and so when he left here, he did not have a great deal of.
What were the circumstances of his going to Oregon?
The Peels, apparently some of the brothers of the man that died, this Mr. Peel, the husband of Papa Linn's second wife, lived out in that area, and they induced him to come out there. And I think he took some of his stepsons with him, and they wanted to move out there, these men, but they couldn't get his wife to come. So he actually, in 1892, we have a little letter that he had written to my mother telling him that he, I think this was a little birthday gift, he had sent her a little watch, and he said this was all he was able to do. He lived in the area of the Hasidaid Lighthouse. If you ever go to the Oregon coast, this is a beautiful area. I have one of the, I don't have that here now, that shows the the scenery along that coast. We've been there twice. That lighthouse has been electrified now, but he was involved in the construction of that lighthouse in 1892, and that was the date of that letter that he sent back from Alpha, Oregon. It was a post office, probably a little community where he lived, and I have a story here that was written by a man that lived with him. This is George Peel, where he's writing to relatives, and it brings out some things that are rather interesting. He mentions that he had been, Papa Linn had been well-to-do at one time, and he felt he was one of the finest men that he knew of his stepfather. He had lived with him on the Oregon coast for several months in a little log house, 10 by 12 feet, with a dirt floor, ferns for a bed, no stove, cooked with what little they had to cook on a fireplace that he built out of rocks. Their dishes were tin plates, a coffee cup, maybe 2 frying pans in a Dutch oven where they baked their bread on the fireplace. He lived with Mr. Linn while building a big log house which was never finished. And they had very little to eat during those days. They were hard days, lonely days. For weeks at a time they saw no one but themselves. There was no wagon road, just a foot trail, and their nearest neighbor was about 5 miles away. They had no newspaper, very little mail, and very little money. This man says, I'm past 75 years of age, and I look back, I can still see Mr. Linn smoking his pipe sitting by the fireplace. I still say there is not a Linn or a Peel who learned to know a man as I learned to know him in those trying times. He was a real man, a man that I loved and admired. He was always very kind to me. So he's talking very well about his stepfather. He died before I was born in 1901. My mother had, to my knowledge, never had except that one letter to show. And she was very young when he died. So
now, he died in Higgins, Texas. Now, what were the circumstances of getting down there?
He apparently decided to go down in that area, and I think there must have been some type of a homesteading, or he bought out a homesteader and planted a timber claim down there out of the Locust Tree. They call it the Locust Grove Ranch, and it's close to Higgins. I think another thing that had some influence on him was that Mr. Daniel H. Page, who had lived east of Lindsborg, was a good friend of his, and apparently had gone down into that area ahead of him. This was in 1898 when the Linns left. Apparently he took one of his sons with, and some of his stepsons, and the rest of them came on the train. But they went down there with a wagon and horses, made that trip
to Texas,
that far down to Texas. And Abner Lundquist was a good friend of Johnny Linn. They were about the same age, and he told how he saw them leave. They had a beautiful team of black horses pulling their wagon, and they were going to camp out along the way, and he wished he was going with them. He would have liked to go. But it was probably a little bit rugged to travel that way, and then the rest of the family, the girls and so on, came later on the train.
And his wife,
right.
Carolina.
Right.
Carolina.
And, of course, they're both buried in that Higgins, Texas cemetery. I've had correspondence with the Page grandson and the son of Daniel Page, and apparently they lived right adjacent to each down there. So I think that might have had something to do. He was a pioneering type, and apparently this was a new area that was opening up. He had a chance to get land, start over again. There are oil wells on that farm down in Texas now, and there are also oil right on the edge of the land up in the bluffs where he lost it all.
It seems to me that he was quite interested in timber. Would he have come from a timberous area in Sweden originally?
Well, of course, there's some timber, I think, in that area, too.
Where did he come from in Sweden?
It was Borås is the name of the town, and it was, we visited there in our trip to Sweden. I didn't notice there was an awful lot of timber in that area, but he apparently liked that type of thing, and he liked animals, cattle, and so on, and he was good with his hands, excellent stone person. The courthouse job, I don't know whether we want to mention that now, but he was living down there on the Fremont farm when they started building the McPherson County Courthouse. They laid the cornerstone in May of 1894, and they hired a man by the name of Jack from Hutchinson as the contractor, and apparently they felt they wanted to have a stone foreman on this, and someone recommended Grandpa Linn as an excellent stone man, so they hired him for $3 a day as the foreman on all that stonework on the courthouse. Mm. And that stone came from Cottonwood Falls over in that area, over in that Lyon County, I guess, over there, Chase County. Mm. And of course the courthouse now has been restored and everyone is proud, but that building is built to stay there, and
very solid.
Very solid. They said that some of the people that worked for him said he was very particular, that they didn't do it right, he'd make them tear it out and replace it and do it over again. So he was a good stone mason and apparently enjoyed doing that type of work.
Well, a very impressive man, a real pioneer, and what you have said is most interesting. Now let's go to, or do you have anything more that you'd like to say about Papa Linn?
Let's see if there are. I think we've covered most of the things that, of course, that courthouse cost $40,000 back when it was built in 1894, and they laid the cornerstone in May and they moved into it in December. Now, I never could figure that out, as long as it takes our contractors today to build buildings, how they could ever do that with those big stones and that large a building. And they also built the jail, which was a $10,000 building at the same time. While he was working on the courthouse and the jail, he lived in the home of A.J. Gustafson, who lived out on this now First Street here in McPherson. And when I was going into the Navy, I lived with them and worked with them in the harvest one summer, and I slept in his room in that house. They said, that's where your grandfather slept when he worked on the courthouse. And each weekend he would walk home. That was one of the things that Mr. Page, the grandson of Daniel Page, mentioned, that he could remember him barefooted all the time. And that's hard to imagine. A man would be walking barefoot out in the pastures and snakes and so on that you might run into, but apparently he didn't enjoy wearing shoes, so that's one of the things that was typical, him having barefooted. Another thing that I ran into that I felt was rather interesting, that the Pages and the Linns lived close to another ranch down in the Higgins area, and the man that owned this ranch was named Frank Ewing. On this Ewing ranch is where the late Will Rogers worked when he was a cowboy, and before he became famous as an entertainer. And Ewing later was at the time of Will Rogers' funeral, this ranch owner was a pallbearer at Will Rogers' funeral. So that was another little interesting sidelight.
And this Page that you're talking, is this the Page that was originally on?
It was Peter Jacobson, would be my great-great-grandfather. They called him Abel, and then his son was Matthias Peterson. And then
she'd play around and tease me with her care.
A very detailed genealogy of your paternal ancestry on your father's side, your grandfather Ingrid Peterson. Would you give us some account of the line as it goes down these days?
Yes, we're indebted to my father's cousin, Reverend Hans Peterson, for looking this up and tracing this through the church records in Denmark. But as far as he was able to go back without a lot of difficulty was to Jacob Peterson, who would be my great-great-great-great-grandfather, born about 1700. And this would be in the Schleswig-Holstein area of Denmark, which is close to the German border, close to Tonders, where the family originates as far as we know. His son was Peter Jacobson, would be my great-great-great-grandfather. They called him Abel, and then his son was Matthias Peterson, and then his son was Peter Nissen Peterson, and that Peter Nissen Peterson would be the father of my grandfather Ingrid. And we have a picture that was...
So these are your great-grandparents?
That's true. This is Peter Nissen Peterson. He was born in 1812 and died in 1890, and his wife Merit Christine Rasmussen. They had 9 children, the third of which was my grandfather Ingrid Antonissen Peterson. That's where my father Anton got his name from, Antonissen. And this is their picture. This is as far as we go back with any pictures.
I think you have a picture of their where they lived in Denmark. Do you not?
Yes. We were fortunate enough to be able to visit this farm. This is in the little village of Lillehammerski in Denmark, right close to Tonder. And this house, typical of the homes there, the farm homes, has the barn attached to it, and it, according to the family that lives there, is Charles Peterson, is my father's first cousin, lives there with his family, and it's 400 years old, the home. It's been in the Peterson family something like 300 years. This home, it's, part of it wasn't so modern, but they've kept up that home that's that old.
Now, did you give the names of the 9 children?
I didn't name them. Now, some of these never married. Hannah Marie, unmarried, was the first child. Matthias, unmarried. These are the children of Peter Nissen. Third was my grandfather, Ingward. He was born in 1849 and died in 1926 when I was just 6 years old. This would be my grandfather. Then he had 6 children. Among the first was my father, Peter Anton Peterson. And my aunt, Helga Louise, was the second child of Ingward. And she will be 100 years old on January the 24th, 1986.
Where does she live?
She lives here in McPherson. She is not able to be up and around anymore. She's lost her sight pretty much. She can hear some days. She's pretty good to talk to. And there were 3 other children, Albert Julius, Selma Frederica, and Carl Martin. This is the family of Ingward and Louise Peterson. And my father is the oldest, the tallest in the back row, and then is Aunt Helga, and then Dr. A.J. Albert Peterson, and this is Martin, who died in 1920 in the flu epidemic, and he had a family that left 2 little boys, and this is Selma, who died, left her children, 3 boys. They were probably 8, 9, 10 years old when she died. She had been a school teacher before she was married and lived in Marquette.
So this is the Ingward Peterson.
This is the Ingward Peterson family.
Mm-hmm. Now,
then there are other children. There's Katrina. That branch of the family is lost. Married a blacksmith Jensen. We have tried to find information on them through our relatives. And there was Christina Peterson. We have some information on them. The Deemers, Gita Maria married Christian Deemer, who was also a dame, and they lived in the Pontiac, Illinois area. Then there was Anna, who did not marry. Christian Nissen, several of these names are the same. The 8th and 9th child were both Christian Nissen. Mm-hmm. And the one of them only lived 1 year, and then the next child they named with the same name. And he was a bachelor, lived in America, and worked in a dairy in Brooklyn for some time, and went back to Denmark and passed away. So it was a large family.
Yeah. You have, I think you have some interesting details about your grandfather, Ingward Peterson's settling in this community.
Yes, he, of course, I think, was one of those who was concerned about having to fight in the wars that were going on over with Germany and the Prussians and so on. So he left that country and came over to America with several other Danes and settled in the northeast part of McPherson Township, just about 2 miles north of McPherson. There were others. He homesteaded in that farm, a quarter section. He had other Danes with him, Matson, Gibson, C.K. Peterson, and so on, and they stayed, and their family still owned the land. And my grandfather apparently had the wanderlust and went on to California, and my father had traced, in his story of his father, mentioned that he'd been in Virginia City, Nevada, when it was a booming mining town. He went to the San Francisco area when they were mining, where a lot of the Chinese workers were involved, and he worked on a schooner hauling cargo of brick from across the Bay Area to San Francisco when they were building buildings. Then he came to Stockton, where he worked in a gas plant, and some 9 years, and accumulated money, something like $9,000, to go back to his home country of Denmark and then return to Kansas and buy a farm in the north part of New Gotland Township, and to marry a Swedish girl, my grandmother, who was Louise Hilding, Anna Louise Hilding. And of course
She was Swedish.
She was Swedish, so he, rather than have the confusion of spelling his name Peterson, he just went ahead and changed it to Peterson, and that's the way it was always spelled. But his relatives in Denmark all spell it Peterson.
Now, how did they happen to meet? I mean,
they met in Stockton, California. I think she was working in an orphanage. She had worked in an orphanage in North Shipping area in Sweden, where she grew up as a girl. And then her brothers, one of them settled in Oregon and one settled in California, paid her away to come out to be with them. And then she went to work in this orphanage, and that's apparently where she met him in Stockton.
And then he persuaded her to become a farm wife.
Right. There are other stories about him. He was very strong because he had the experience and the exercise of shoveling coal and coke for 9 years, and they used to say he worked for several men, and he expected his people to be able to work like he did. So he was a little on the temperamental side. I think his wife would kind of dread any of this when he would be angry or something like that. There are several stories that I have that my father told of him. One time he'd worked so hard that his shoulders and arms were sore, and his wife, he told her to rub liniment on it, and then he got his fingers in the liniment and got it in his eyes, and he said, "Vad var det för liniment?" What kind of liniment was that hurt his eyes? I know we've had other stories that he was a strong, husky man. He was a hard worker. He accumulated other farms in that vicinity too.
Do you have anything special about your grandmother, Anna Louisa Hilding?
Well, she was a very religious person. My father gives her credit for being the religious leader of the family. They lived some miles away from the New Gotland Church, but as they could, and she brought the children up in the church and in the Sunday school. My father, I think, when he originally started school, his mother encouraged him to be a pastor, but I think he never felt that he was suited to be a pastor, so he was intelligent, got good grades and everything, but he did not go in that direction. He graduated from Bethany College in 1906 and went on to the West Coast, where he got into San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle and Portland. He worked in post offices in several of those towns, and was a conductor in the streetcar line, and had various jobs, and went back to Chicago and worked in the Swedish American Tribune office. Came back to the Lindsborg area and farmed with his brother until Miss Martin died after he'd been married and had 2 little children in 1920, and my father then took over the farm.
Is this the John Johnson farm?
This was the Johnson farm, which was the farm, I think, in Section 3 of New Gotland.
New Gotland Township.
And there was a Beard farm that was right across the road in Catty Corner in Smoky Hill Township. And then there was also the Bergstrom farm, which I had mentioned. The man went to the Klondike and never came back. They bought that farm.
And the Ingrid Petersons were the parents of how many children, and who were they?
Well, they had 5 children. Peter, Anton, Helga Louise, Albert Julius, Selma Frederica, and Carl Martin. So there were 5 children in the family. They called him Danska Peterson because he was Danish. That was to segregate him from others who had nicknames of various types, but that was his designation.
Do you have any more details about that particular farm? I think you have some pictures of
Yes, when we were in Denmark, we found this picture on the wall in the home there that's 400 years old. And we found out that my aunt had this original of this picture, so we've had copies made of it. This was the original. They probably lived in something even less significant than this, but this was their first house. And this picture shows the family on the front porch and the couple of hired men with their horses and some of their machinery and so on. So that was more or less the beginning of the farming. And then later on they added to the home, and this shows the family sitting on the porch there, and they've added to the small, it looked like it could have been 2 or 3 room originally, and then they've added quite extensively. And then later on, with farm buildings, it was quite a sizable farm, and I know my father mentioned that he probably had the highest tax valuation of any of the farms in that township, so he was more or less a big farmer with cattle and so on, besides the grains.
So your father was Anton, one of 5 children. So I'd like to hear something about his early life, marriage, and his occupation.
Well, Anton, being the oldest in the family, was given the privilege of going to Bethany College, and he graduated in 1906. He was a good student, and I don't think he was really intended to be a farmer, because I know my mother used to tell me when I was a young boy that he didn't sleep well. I think it bothered him, the physical. He just wasn't a real strong man. So he was elected as a township trustee, I think, in Smoky Hill Township back in the early 20s, and they were persuaded him to run for county clerk in 1925. And he was elected, and we moved to McPherson. My brother and I were probably 3, 4, 5 years old. We moved to McPherson. That was the extent of our being on the farm, and he served as county clerk something like 22 years, and then was also in the courthouse as deputy and so on, until it's about some 32 years in total. And I think this was the type of occupation that he enjoyed, that type of work.
You mentioned your father going to Bethany. Were there any in your ancestries who were connected with the terrible Swedes? Well,
he was on several of those teams. There are pictures in some of their pictures of the team, and he always stressed that he wasn't on the first team or anything like that, but he was on the team, and I think he was a substitute. But a lot of the men that played on the terrible Swedes were older men even, and some of them were almost semi-pros. They recruited them because of their abilities to play football, but he told of how they used to train under Benny Owen. They'd run the road past the cemetery, they'd run clear over by the river, and that would be several miles out, and then practice and then run back. So they must have kept in good training, and they had some real teams in those days, and went played larger universities and colleges and had some real records, but they really had some of their players, I think, were recruited for their abilities, although there were some good students among those men too. A lot of sweet names too among them.
In a little while, I'm going to talk with your wife Mary about her ancestry, but first, just some details about your own family. Mary was also a Peterson, right? Your wife?
Mary comes from the Swedish Petersons, and our grandparents were neighbors, and our parents knew each other well. My father and her father went to school, grade school together, and so after the war, I was involved in the Navy for something like almost 4 years, and I came back, and we were married in 1950. I was a little on the slow side of being married. I was 30 years old. We have 2 children, Marilyn and Truce, and Marilyn and her family live in Salina, and Truce lives here in McPherson. We've lived in McPherson all the time since we were married, and we have a lot of relatives, especially on her side. Our Peterson family is not so large, but she has a lot of stem out from the Peterson family.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about what you know about this building called the Ark, an early building in Lindsborg, where it might have been located. And
well, to my knowledge, I've read mention in Dr. Lindquist's book that when the McPherson County seat was moved from to Lindsborg from Sled Hall, why the Ark was where they had the offices, and I understood it was at the corner of Main and Lincoln Street, which would probably be where the Sundstrom building is.
It must have been a rather large frame building then, because
evidently it was.
I've understood that church services were held there. Swedish Methodist held church services there. Finally, a Danish citizen around Lindsborg by the name of Carl Thompson. You have some stories that would be interesting to hear that Carl Thompson told you.
Carl Thompson told me these two stories just before he went back to Denmark, and probably may have known that he would never see me again, and he called me aside. We'd been to a dedication ceremony at a building here in McPherson, and he told me he wanted to tell me of these two stories that he had heard. One of them he'd heard, at least one of them he'd heard from my uncle, who of course was no longer living, and I had never heard the stories. One of them was relative to the days when my grandfather Ingwart had been involved in working on the railroad. Some of the Swedes worked on the railroad, he worked on the railroads, and then got involved in the buffalo hunting. And he would shoot buffalo. This was out in the Hayes, Ellsworth area apparently, and he would shoot the buffalo, and they had colored man Negroes who would go with them and skin the creatures, and then they'd they'd pick up whatever they could use from the animals, and the remainder would be left on the prairie. But they got into a terrible blizzard, and these colored men were big, husky men, and they crawled under the hides of the buffalo, and my grandfather was between two of these big colored men with the buffalo hides over them. They were able to survive the blizzard, and he said he would surely have frozen to death had he not had these big husky Negroes, one on either side of him, to prevent him from freezing. The other story related to a sand pit, and I think this was on the farm that later became
That's the swimming hole.
Where the Lindsborg swimming hole was, and this relative, it would be a brother of Ingwart, came over to America and worked for a while with Ingwart, and been sent down to the sand pit to get a load of sand, had his wagon in the pit, and the pit caved in on he and his horses, and they had to shovel out the sand in order to get them out of the sand pit. This is the same brother of Ingwart's who later on had a farm over in the Burdick area and farmed there for something like 14 years, and then went back to Denmark when his brother died to take over the family farm. And he was a bachelor when he lived in America, and he apparently worked with Ingwart for a while before he took over that farm.
Now, to whom does that firearm belong that you have there?
This is a little pistol that was belonged to my grandfather Ingwart. It was made by the Carter Ammunition Arms Company, and it doesn't have very much identification, but this was apparently used for self-protection rather than anything. Would not be usable for shooting at buffalo or anything of that nature, but these pioneers had to carry in certain areas, I'm sure, arms to protect themselves. And
well, wasn't California kind of a
he
wild
probably had this with him when he was out in California during the gold rush days, and so that's one of my souvenirs that I kept from my
That's probably quite old.
It would probably be over 100 years old.
Did you mention a brand or name or manufacturer or anything?
It was made by Carter.
Carter.
And I think it says Bulldog or something like that on it. It's very just difficult to read the numbers or anything on it. Mm-hmm. But it is an old little pistol.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, thank you very much. Momentarily we will talk to your wife about what she knows and tell us about her Peterson ancestry. Mary, we'd like to hear about your great grandparents on your mother's side. I understand there are some interesting things to be told about.
Yes, they were Johannes and Gunilla. She was Ol's daughter, because it didn't use the son over in Sweden. It was daughter, you know, the daughter. Nelson was the last name. And of course, it was spelled Nilsson over there. But
Two S's.
But it was changed here to just Nilsson, like all the ones around here are. But they came from Sweden, from the Hishult area of the Småland in Sweden, in 1856, and
Thank goodness.
they did not come to this area, however, they came to Illinois, but they came on that same boat, as they always said. Of course, we know it was a ship. That Dr. Swenson, the president of Bethany College's parents, came on that at that same time that they left over there and were on this ship for 6 weeks. My grandmother was the only child that these Nelsons had at that time, and she had her first birthday during that time and learned to walk while she was on the ship during these 6 weeks of coming overseas. They lived then in the Chicago area and had been in various places around Chicago, not necessarily in Chicago the whole time, but in 1871 during the Chicago fire they were there. My grandfather was a carpenter and a shoeman at the same time, and he had a little shop across the river from where the main part of the fire was. So they carried all these various objects that they possibly could across the river to Grandpa's shack, or whatever it was, his little carpenter shoe cobbler shop, so that they could save as many things as possible. My grandmother also was I'd say she really had thoughts ahead, because they had enough time to think about some of these things with the fire coming, you know, that it was bad. So she had them help her and dig a hole that was big enough that she put the monkey stove and some of the skillets and kettles down into this hole.
What on earth is a monkey stove?
You don't know what a monkey stove is? Well, it's an old-fashioned two-burner stove that you would cook on, and I'm sure you'd see it in an antique store. I don't know what they call them now, but we even had one out on the farm that we said was like the one they'd had. It wasn't the one that they'd had, of course. But after the fire was over, they went back and dug it back up. This is cast iron, you know, it didn't burn when it was down in the ground. But some of the things that we have laughed about was that my grandmother, being the oldest in 71, of course, having been born in 55, was responsible for getting her little sister that was only between 2 and 3 years old, and 3 big heavy irons, the ones with the handle that's fastened to the flat irons, you know, across the river. Can you imagine that they thought those irons were so important that they... In fact, I have one of those irons that my grandmother had carried, and I don't know why they would have carried 3 of those heavy things. But.
And did she ever come to Kansas then?
Yes, then they came to Kansas in 1875 and built a house on the place that's 3 miles north and 4.5 miles east of McPherson. It's in Delmore Township, and this was the home of the Nelsons, and they lived there until Grandpa Nelson passed away. Well, I guess he actually died here in McPherson, but he was getting very feeble, and they moved into McPherson, and then my grandparents moved on that farm.
But your grandfather there was mainly a farmer.
Farmer and carpenter.
You do not have a picture?
I do not have a picture of him. I have a picture of his wife, my grandmother, Gunilla, Ol's daughter, Nelson. But the only small pictures we have of my grandfather are too small to hold up here.
Now, is there anything more that you'd like to say about your maternal grandparents?
Well, then this is my maternal grandparents, the oldest daughter of this Johannes and Gunilla Nelson. She's Nellie, and she married John P. Hultgreen, and they lived on that same farm that I just told you for a short time. In fact, my mother was born there, and she was born in 1892. Then later they moved over closer to Galva area. But this is a picture of the Holtgreens, which is my grandparents.
Okay. Now, are we ready to go then to your paternal side?
I believe so. They are, I start out with my grandfather on here because my grandparents did not come here until after all their children were here, and their children brought them over here because they wanted them to be here in the United States. But all their 8 children were in the States before the
And then they sent for their...
They sent for the parents, and the parents never had their own home here. There were 6 of them that lived in and around the Lindsborg, New Gotland area, and they would spend 2 months a year with each other.
Did they ever learn to speak English?
No, they always spoke Swedish. In fact, even these grandparents that I'm showing the picture, that's John and Christine Peterson, they only spoke Swedish also. They did not. Maybe grandmother knew a few words in English, but most
Now
of
their
them.
names again
This
were
is John and Christine Peterson.
John and Christine Peterson, spelled with an O-M.
Right,
Is it
that's Swedish. It's Swedish. My grandfather there again was in the Chicago fire. He had come to this country as a very young man, single, and was in the Chicago area. He was working for Borden's Milk Company. And at the time of the fire, and as he couldn't drink the water, they were delivering a lot of milk. He later then went to work for the John Deere Plow Company in Moline, Illinois. He had saved money and would send for first one brother and then another. And one time he had an interesting experience. He was expecting one brother. He had sent $300 over to the homeland to have this brother come. And when he met the train, why, he had 2 brothers that were, the one was very small in stature, even though he was older than the one that he was thinking he was sending for. And when he was at the area where they were going to leave, they said, that kid can go along for $19. And so they didn't tell him that kid was older, and they let him go he had to go and hunt up $19 to borrow from somebody because they only had the $300 they'd gotten from my grandpa. But he had a pleasant surprise to have 2 brothers instead of 1 come to him. He and his wife were married. She came over here.
Who was she?
She was Christine Carlson. And she was an orphan. She did not really know if her last name was Carlson or if it was just the name that an old lady that she was living with had. She did not know the month or the day that she was born. She only knew the year, and it was in wintertime. So her children, when they became old enough to celebrate birthdays, said December the 6th is her birthday because they thought they should celebrate on a certain day. But that's only one chance out of 365 that it's right.
How many children did they have?
They had 8 children. John and let me stop and think here. I'm getting mixed up. John and Christine had 5 children. They are here on this picture. My father, Emma was the oldest, and my father was the second one. Maybe shall I point to them here for you? Emma, Oscar, Clara is the youngest that's over here. Alma Holt, that you might have known in Lindsborg area, and the little boy in the middle is Axel Peterson. He also lived in Lindsborg. The 3 have always lived in and around the Lindsborg or New Gotland area. The 2 girls, Emma and Clara, moved to California.
And Lamar is the Axel.
Yes, Lamar is the oldest son of Axel Peterson. Axel had 3 sons, Lamar, Don, and Jerry. And
now, which one is your father in here?
This one right here.
Oh, the tallest.
The tallest one, and he was about 5'9" in his good years. So he wasn't very tall. They were very short people. He lived until he was 99 and a half years old. He just passed away in 77. He was born in 1878, and he passed away in August of 1977. My father.
And this is...
And this is another picture of my dad and my mother. This is Oscar and Anna Peterson. Now, John and Christine Peterson purchased the homestead from a man in 1877 when they came to Delmore Township. I have a painting here that was done by a neighbor boy, Dallin Jacobson, who painted this, and it's very much the way my home place looks out there. That is not the way it looked, of course, way back when they first homesteaded. They had a sod house for 8 years, and after that 8 years, they built this house that I have a picture of here, and it was there until 1926, when the house that you just took the picture of on the painting was built.
Did we see all the other pictures that you got there? These other ones?
Yeah, these two were from Mother's side.
Yes.
I believe you have seen the pictures.
Now, your father was a farmer then?
Yes. Oh, yes, I showed this. Yes, he was a farmer all his life, having not left the farm even for any longer period of time, but one time he went on a trip for 5 weeks. Otherwise, he didn't leave the farm until he moved to town in 1946, when my brother, Linn Peterson, moved on the farm. He was married and moved on the farm. And the farm is still in the family. Laverne owns it now, and we're real happy to stay in the family like that.
I think you have a very interesting story about some netting.
Oh, yes, back in the days when my grandmother, Christine Peterson, had just the two children, Aunt Emma and my dad. She would walk across the fields about 3 miles across the prairie, as they said, with her knitting in her hand, and she'd have the oldest child, which was Aunt Emma, holding on to her apron strings in the back, and then my father was holding on to Emma, and they were walking on to Ingrid Peterson's place, which was ended up being Lynn's grandparents, which of course Linn and I weren't even in the planning back in those days. But they would walk over and visit, and she would knit all the way over there, and the children were to hang on to the back, and then they would be there during the day or how much time they spent and walk on back home. And she would say that she had a pair of knitted stockings done when she came home after spending the day with Louise, Mrs. Ingrid Peterson. Then Louise would in turn do the same thing when she came to see Christine, where she had her two oldest ones that have to hold on to her apron strings, and we think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I can't imagine how one can knit walking. I suppose it's easily done, I suppose.
They could do two things at once, couldn't they?
I should say. Do you have any other stories or reminiscences that you can share?
Oh, you know, as you go on and talk, things come to mind, but it's always hard to think of everything. I believe that's all the notes that I really have written down here.
Well, this has been very, very interesting. And our thanks to you and to Linn for sharing your experiences, your knowledge of your families. We do appreciate it very, very much.
Thank you.
As a postscript, we'd like to hear a couple more stories. I understand you had one about the Texas Longhorns.
That's right. My father tells while they were still living in this sod house that all of a sudden there were some cowboys that came along and warned them that there was a lot of Texas Longhorns are coming through this area, and get your children inside the house, inside this little sod house. Well, it was just like the height of a stack or something, you know, and those cattle come like they were just wild, hundreds of them, and they trampled around the little sod house, and his mother was so afraid that it was just going to they were trampled in, but the cowboys got them intact, so they didn't step on the house, but they had really been all around the house there, and of course the children were scared to death too as they were looking out the window.
Do you know, would this have been at the time when they had crops in the ground and everything?
Well, I don't know that. I didn't hear that told by my dad, but we've always thought that these were probably some of the longhorns that they were herding up the way from on the Chisholm Trail, and they were a little bit off the track to be over there.
That's the first story that I've heard involving.
involving that. And then, you have a rattlesnake? Who has the rattlesnake?
Well, that was my father was laying it. Well, I have two rattlesnake stories. In fact, the one rattlesnake story was while he was still in this sod house, and my father was sleeping in his crib, and his mother looked over the crib, and there was a rattlesnake hanging right down over whatever he was sleeping on, whatever kind of a little crib that they had. She wasn't right sure how she was going to grab that baby out without getting bit, but she pulled him out just as the snake went down into the crib, and so she was so thankful that she got her little boy out of there. Then the other one is that this is when they were in this house that I showed you the picture of, so it would have been after 1886, the grandmother was picking wood in a wood pile and got bit on her finger with a rattlesnake, and they had a signal between her and her husband that if she needed help, she'd put this tea towel up on this post, and he would see it out in the field, and he'd come home. Well, he didn't look at that every time he came to the end of the round, to come back. So it was some time before he saw that tea towel was hanging on the post, and when he came fast home. Well, by this time, her arm was swelling up, clear up to her arm, and he quickly tied a band around her arm so it wasn't going to go any further, but poison was going. The story always was that they needed some whiskey for the person to have for snake bite. Well, they didn't have any in their house. They were a very religious family that didn't believe in this, but they knew that it was a neighbor that would have some, so they sent my dad to run and get some at this neighbor. Well, as it was, he'd been using his whiskey for other things than for a snake bite, so he only had a thimbleful. But he set that on down, and Grandma took that. But then they had to go 3 miles further to another neighbor to get some more whiskey. By that time, this poison was already going through Grandma so much that when she drank it, she said, "Well, what's that for water you're giving me? That doesn't do any good." She couldn't even tell that it was supposed to be real strong whiskey, but it saved her. So
really?
She came through it. She lived
I didn't know that would have any effect at all upon her.
That was what they used back in those days, I guess.
You should tell the story of your dad being the mail carrier, too. That was kind of...
Oh, yes. My father was probably one of the first rural mail carriers, really. If you really want to call it that. They decided that he was from the Delmore Post Office, which was just there was post offices in pretty near every little township and area, and there were several neighbors that got together and said, we ought to have just one person go and get this mail. It's so far to go and get. Well, Oscar, you'd be a good one to go. Why don't you be the one? We'll declare that we trust you and that you can be. So his sister made him a special kind of a bag out of oilcloth that he could button up and put inside of his coat, and he would go over twice a week and get the mail on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and it would be anywhere from 3 to 6 to 7 miles away, depending on which household was the postmaster at that time. And he would get this mail and bring it back. There were 8 people on his route. He said he was supposed to get $1 a year for being a postman, going to $1 a year for doing this twice a week. He would take young horses. They liked horses and would break them. He would take them and break them riding, going there. So he felt like he wasn't exactly wasting his time and energy. He was getting these young horses so that they were rideable and handleable. And so he'd do this, and then he'd deliver the mail. Well, one man was his uncle, which was his father's brother that lived a half a mile. He was quite poor, so don't charge Uncle Herman for anything. And, of course, he didn't charge his dad for anything. And then there was another man along the way that he didn't, for some reason or other, didn't get paid for. So he usually got $5 a year for doing this. And he did this for 5 years, but he said that it was still an experience, and he was glad he did it.
Yeah, it was. Do you have any stories, Lynn?
Now you hit me. I was thinking of her stories. I'm sure there are other stories I can think of, and I just haven't.
We took my dad on a tape recorder back it was in the 60s, with some of his stories, which we're real thankful that we did, because he had a real good memory. Linn always kind of joked about it, said Dad told these stories and he even breathed the same spot when he told them. They just didn't vary.
You have your father on a tape?
Would
that be the reel-to-reel tape or cassette?
No, we got it onto a cassette tape here just not very long ago. It was on a reel-to-reel tape, and we had a terrible time getting something to play it on so that we could get it on a cassette, because we knew that it'd soon be lost if we didn't.
We had our son, he was a little fella at the time, time. He says, "Grandpa, tell me some of the stories of the old times."
Well,
So we got them on the tape.
well, wonderful.
We never got my father on.
I'd love to hear those stories sometime.
Well, we'd be
Well,
glad to
thank you
share.
folks again for all of these
It's
contributions.
been nice having you here.
Thank you.